Okay, so to draw a simple bar graph, you want to select the data that you want to go on your graph. In this case, we want our reaction time scores. And you select Insert. And then we want to draw a bar graph. So you just select the bar graph button and choose a simple bar graph that looks like that. Now, in the latest version of Excel, there are these handy buttons on the side of your graph that allow you to change things about the way it looks. So if you click on this plus button, it has a number of chart elements that you can choose to have or not. So in this case, we definitely want axes, and we do want axis titles. We don't necessarily need a chart title. It's not common to see a chart title at the top. So if we unclick that one, we get rid of the reaction time chart title at the top. You can have data labels if you want. It's not common to see those in presentations though, so we won't choose that one. You can put a data table at the bottom if you want to. We don't really need to do that. I'm going to show you how to do error bars in a second, so we'll leave that one. I don't particularly like the look of grid lines. I don't think they're necessary. They're not really APA style, so we'll get rid of the grid lines. You can have, if you have more than one condition on a graph, you can have a legend. So if you had blue bars and green bars and red bars, and you wanted a legend to differentiate what those three colors of bars are, you can put your legend. If you want to, you can put a trend line, but in this case that's not really appropriate. So that is changed by selecting those options. It's changed how our graph looks a little bit. So what we want to do here, so we're talking about reaction times in seconds, and when you're doing your graphs for your presentation, you want to be really careful that the scale that you plot your data on doesn't mislead the audience about how big your differences actually are. So here we're talking about reaction times in seconds. So here we're talking 0.58 of a second to 0.78 of a second. So this whole axis spans only 200 milliseconds. But in plotting the graph like this, Excel has made the difference between condition 1 and condition 2 look much bigger than it actually is. So what we want to do is change the scale that the graph is plotted on to make that difference look a little more reasonable. So if you click on the y-axis and click right click to change the format of the axis, it'll give you options to change the scale. So to be fair, let's make the scale go from half a second to 1 second. That looks more reasonable. All right, so when you're putting your graphs together for your presentation, it's really important that the scale doesn't mislead the audience, but it's also important that you label both the X and Y axis to make sure that the audience knows exactly what you're plotting. So we clicked the option to have axis titles, and all we need to do is double click on them to change what this says. So we'll call this reaction time in seconds. Oops. And we'll change this one and call this condition. All right, now we only selected the data. So if we click here, it tells you what it's plotting. And we only selected the data and asked it to draw a graph. And so it's assumed that the differentiation between these conditions is 1, 2, 3. But you can change that. So what we might like to do is relabel our conditions 1, 2, and 3 to be something more meaningful, so that the audience who are listening to your presentation know exactly what's plotted on the y-axis and what the different bars on the x-axis refer to. So let's imagine that condition 1 is the control condition, condition 2 is congruent trials, and condition 3 is incongruent trials. What we can do is format the data series. What is it doing? Here we go. Select data. So rather than having 1, 2, 3, what you can do is edit this horizontal category axis labels and select these 3 things to be your axis labels instead of the default 1, 2, 3. And so what that has done now is made it really clear for those who are listening to your presentation that this graph is plotting reaction time on the y-axis and condition, and the 3 conditions were control condition, congruent condition and incongruent condition. Now for some reason it seems like the y-axis doesn't really have a line on it, which we would like to do. Let's see if we can find the option to make that line appear here. Fill and line. So we'll go line. This is automatic. We want it to give us a solid line that is colored black. Does that make a difference? It does. We should probably do the same thing for the x-axis as well. So if we go solid line and black. Okay. So the other thing that's really important when you are putting together a graph for a presentation, your people in the audience who are wanting to get their head around the results, it's helpful for them to know what you're plotting on the y-axis and what the conditions on the x-axis are, but it's also helpful to use error bars on your graph so that they can get a ballpark kind of idea which differences were likely to be statistically significant. So we've already calculated standard errors here. Now we can just add them to the graph. So if you select your bars and you want to pull this out a little bit, the option here is to add chart elements and error bars. So if we select that one and go across here, there are some options that pull up. So you can see that. So there are options that pull up when you select and go across this arrow. Now, we always want to plot standard errors on our bars, and Excel gives you an option to do standard error, but what data it's using to pop those, what it thinks are standard error bars on your graph, I don't know. So it's guessing what the standard error of this data is. What you want to do is actually plot the real standard error. So you choose error bars, go across, ignore the standard error option that it gives you and go down to more options. Here what you want to do is choose this custom. So rather than the default standard error, you want to choose this custom, which gives you the option to specify the value. So if you go specify the value here, you can actually select the values that you want it to use as standard error. So if you delete what's there and select those 3 values that you've calculated as the positive standard error, and then do the same, delete and add the negative standard error and go OK, there's your standard error, your real standard errors, which actually are much bigger than the default that Excel gives you. Okay, so these blue bars are the default for this particular template of Excel graph. You can change that. So you can change colors using another one of the Excel color templates. Let's say we wanted red bars, or we can scroll down, maybe we want our bars to just be gray. Oh, that color, let's go teal. So you can change the color of your bars and other aesthetic things using the chart area. So you can change the fill, what color they're filled with, whether they have a border on them. At the moment the border is gray, but if you wanted to, you could make that black. You want to be careful to make sure that when you're doing graphs for your presentation that you choose a fairly innocuous color and that the condition differences are really easy to see with differences in color. Okay, once you've decided on what your perfect graph format is, you another thing, at the moment the font here is really very small, and when you're doing graphs for your presentation you want to make sure that people at the back of the room are going to be able to read the difference between control, congruent and incongruent. So if you select your graph, you can simply change the size of the font, which is a good idea.